Recording in progress, he said. What? Don't worry.
Okay. Rick, would you like to take it?
Yes. That's it. Couldn't read that. Are we ready? Are you just waiting for me to start, or are you still doing something? Yes. Okay. Well, do come in, everybody, and have a seat. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. George's Talks, a monthly lecture series in a historic German Lutheran church in the East End of London. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen in St. Georg's Gespräche. I always begin with a sentence of German as well, just to link us to the historic founding fathers of this building. I won't speak any more German from this point on. The building dates from 1762, and it's lovely to see so many of the pews in front of me this evening full. Also, welcome to the online audience. We Zoom these lectures and present them live. Every third Tuesday of the month is the lecture night in the building. 1762 is the date when this building was created by a group of migrant German sugar makers, sugar refiners, who came here because their skills at that time did not exist in this country, and they came to fill a gap. It's a very atmospheric 18th century building, hardly changed in 250 years, still with its original pews, its German memorial tablets around the walls, and its wheezy organ, which is played the first Saturday of every month, is an organ vespers, part recital, part religious ceremonial. Otherwise, the building is no longer used as a place of worship. The congregation last worshipped here regularly in the 1990s and then moved to a more modern building in London, a German Lutheran congregation. Nowadays, the building is used as a venue for talks, sometimes concerts, sometimes film locations. It's, as you can tell, those of you who are here, it's a perfect place for 18th century productions and weddings occasionally. In December, a Christmas carol concert. I'll give you the date later, I forget which it is, but it's a wonderful place to have an early celebration of Christmas too. Imo?
December 13th.
December the 13th. My right-hand man has told me the date. Rick Jones is my name. I'm proud to be a member of the committee here that looks after the building. The heart of the East End, Whitechapel. Our speaker this evening is himself a resident of the East End of London, an East Ender, born in this part of the world. after his early studies in French history, he became a teacher and taught in schools around the East End of London and other places in England, and also in many parts of the world, the Near East and Hong Kong in particular. So he's someone who's given his life to education and is now once again at the end of towards the end of his professional life, living here, resident in London. So there could hardly be a more suitable speaker on the subject this evening, Clement Attlee, who was MP for Limehouse for almost his entire political career. And I shall leave our speaker now to continue with the story. Will you please welcome Mr. Geoff Cosson. Over to you.
Is it working? Can you just check? No, that's the usual thing. So what we need to do is end slideshow. Start it up again. What's up?
Technology is as old as the children.
It's as different every time. Now I need to share the screen again. Can you test it? Resume slideshow. I think now.
Yes, right. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you especially for knowing how to turn the heating on. As Rick said, I come to this talk as someone who's always been interested in political history and in the East End, where I was born. And as Rick said, Attlee's political life was centered entirely here in the East End. He was, in fact, Prime Minister when I was born. Many historians rate his premiership as one of the most effective of the 20th century, making positive changes to British life. And the foundation of the NHS is the one that people must remember. On screen, that was my working title at the beginning. Britain's unlikeliest leader, because it was certain pieces of luck that allowed him to become leader. A career in East London politics, that's entirely where he was mayor and member of parliament. A great prime minister, but I put a question mark there because that's for other people to judge. For many people, that's the photograph that is the most well-known, taken by the photographer Karsh for a postage stamp. He was, as you see, he received many honours in his life. He was created Earl, hereditary title, Knight of the Garter, Order of Merit, which is something that was the gift of the Queen, Companion of Honour, which I think is similar, Privy Councillor, Fellow of the Royal Society. So he did receive many honours in his life. For many people, I think that the last memory that people have is at Winston Churchill's funeral. It's an iconic photograph there. He attended Winston Churchill's funeral in 1965. He was a pallbearer. He did all the rehearsals, and it was very bad for his health. He was too frail to stand at the actual funeral. We will encounter Attlee and Churchill many times in this story. The contrast between Attlee and Churchill, who together led the country through the war, but were political rivals for the decade afterwards, is striking. Attlee himself was modest, he was shy, he was certainly no orator, given to no great gesture, charisma, as they would say today, but very steady. Churchill, of course, was the complete opposite. In this talk, I'm going to cover Attlee's life more or less chronologically. If you have a look at the sections that I'm going to use, his early life, born in 1883, as you can see. The First World War, his awakening to politics, his leadership as Deputy Prime Minister during the Second World War, his time as Prime Minister for 6 years after the war, and then the last section. I'm going to do each section at a time. I'll include a fair amount of the context and the background because I think that's important. It's very important to look at the context and to know how it was and why it was that Attlee had the life that he did and the decisions that he did. As I say, there'll be a fair amount of the background, which is very different to today's in many ways. Even the recent past, I think, is sometimes a foreign country to us. They saw and did things differently. So I'll try and look at the whys and the hows of his career, and not just the who's and what's and whens. We'll do a certain amount of assessment of his successes and failures, but I think these might be more subjective than objective. Depends where you fall on the political divide, I suppose. Okay, so we'll look at the first section first and then work our way through them.
As soon as you turn away from the microphone, the people on my can't hear.
Okay, I'll try and stand absolutely still. We can take questions and comments at the end. He was born in 1883 then, Putney, southwest London, into a fairly prosperous middle-class family, which had servants. His father was a successful city solicitor. The family were committed Anglicans, but politically they were liberals. He was tutored at home in his early age, for some of the time, by a lady who tried to tutor Winston Churchill. That's our first connection. He was sent to boarding school at the age of 9, going on to Haileybury School in Hertfordshire. It's a fee-paying, very traditional school, where he certainly wasn't outstanding. He liked sport, he did cadet force, all the usual things, but he wasn't an outstanding student. And as he said himself, his political views at that time were fairly conservative. He had no reason not to be a conservative with his background. Then in 1901, he went up to Oxford. And I'll just pause a minute. In 1901, he went up to Oxford to read history. And he enjoyed his time there. I've got a photograph of him when he was at Oxford. A nice young man with a super jacket and typical tie and collar of the time. He still had his hair. So he enjoyed his time in Oxford, helped, it must be said, with a generous allowance from his father. He didn't show there any particular interest in politics at all. He never took part in debates or anything of the union. He later described his own views as good, old-fashioned, imperialist conservative. He was described as level-headed, industrious, but not brilliant. He got a second-class honours degree in history. He then began training as a barrister with his father's firm, initially in a Temple. He was called to the bar in 1906, and he worked at his father's firm for a while, but he appears not to have enjoyed it very much at all. He had no particular ambition. Then there was a turning point arrived. His old school, this is him after Oxford. His old school, as I said, Haileybury, which is in Hertfordshire, ran a club in Stepney for working class boys, the sort of charitable social work that I'll talk more about in a minute. He became eventually the live-in manager, and it affected him. He was shocked by the experience of a culture and a society which he'd never encountered before. He was very affected by the poverty and the deprivation the families of the boys that went to the club. And these, of course, were just minutes away from the City of London, the richest part of Britain. This led him, not in some sudden conversion, but over a period of time, to change his political views. He joined the Independent Labour Party, which was one of the predecessors of the current Labour Party, and in 1909, he already stood as a council candidate. He soon came to believe that the only way to improve the lot of the people of Stepney was through the political and the electoral process, government action, not through charity. I'll put the next picture up there. There's a picture of him as a young man, early 20s, with a group of boys in the boys from the boys club. I love the pictures of the boys. They're obviously dressed very smartly. I love this boy's face here. You might say, are these typical scouts from the East End? The club, or its current form, is still there. If you go to step down Stepney Green and you go to St Dunstan's on the edge of St Dunstan's churchyard, there's the Haileybury Youth Centre. It's now run by the local authority, but this is the not quite in the same place as where he worked, in Ben Jonson Road. Okay, in boys' clubs like this, they taught boys boxing, which is they still do actually, the sign on the door. Boxing, they had a cadet force, they had all the usual things to try and raise the boys from the social conditions they were in. So he joined the Labour Party, he began mixing with other like-minded activists, started writing articles, giving lectures. In 1906, there was a famous election, which saw a very strong reforming Liberal government. And during that time, the Labour Party won 2 seats in Parliament. He travelled the country to lots of meetings. In 1912, he took up a position as lecturer at the London School of Economics. One of the tasks that he was enjoyed doing during that time, and he said in his writings, was doing research on workers' pay, because the new Board of Trade was doing, as part of this reforming Liberal government, was trying to do work on setting up a minimum wage. It's interesting that the radical Liberal president of Trade was none other than Winston Churchill, who was a Liberal, as you know, at the time. Clement Attlee's father died and left him an allowance, lucky man. And he seems to have realized that politics would then be his life, giving up the idea of a legal career. But his legal training made him a perfect administrator and a secretary of political parties. He seemed to enjoy the administrative tedium of local party politics. So that's the sort of the events of the first part of his life up until the war. But I want to talk about the context of it, because it explains in some ways how he came to these decisions to change his life. During the latter part of the 19th century, there was a growing feeling that the UK, which was the world's richest country with a huge empire, was not concerned enough about the lives of many of its own citizens, especially those in the poor parts of cities. You've probably seen similar pictures. These are the conditions that many people lived in around here in the East End of London, as we said, within a few hundred meters of the centre of the City of London, the richest part of the richest city on the planet. A lot of people lived in courtyards like this with not very good facilities, with one tap and one lavatory. And this is the sort of conditions that probably most of the population didn't know about. A similar picture. If you look at the very old maps, you see lots of these courtyards. one well or one tapping well. You've probably seen many of these pictures by the French artist Gustave Doré, who came to London. An iconic picture, which I think comes from the Illustrated London News. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep turning my head. I can't do anything about that. Doré was a great illustrator of the conditions of poorer people of London. What I like about that picture actually is that it looks rather silly with the railway engine going past in the back. But actually, if you were a businessman and going to the docks, you get on your train at Fenchurch Street and you'd go by train out to Blackwall or West India Docks, and you would go on that brick viaduct which goes all the way, and you would literally be looking down the streets as you went past. Okay. For many Londoners, the poor districts then downwind of the smoky industrial city really were a foreign land where poverty and crime were endemic. You'll know that writers like Dickens portrayed that underclass of wretched, ungodly people living in squalor, susceptible to terrible vices, probably not so terrible in our imagination, in the imagination of some middle-class Victorians, they would have been. Many of the areas had immigrants, especially towards the end of the 19th century. I don't know if anybody reads books by Jack London anymore, but he wrote a book called The People of the Abyss in 1902, which was about Whitechapel. And Attlee had a copy of this book, which he read many times. One of the things that Jack London said in this book, everything is helpless, hopeless, and dirty. The people are dirty, short of stature, of wretched or beer-sodden appearance. But many people amongst the Victorian middle classes did want to do something. They were concerned. It was, to some people, a national embarrassment. But up to then, governments had not seen people's health or education or welfare as their responsibility. So what could these concerned middle-class people do? Well, there were a variety of things they did do. They could investigate. They could do surveys on the ground, publicize the problems. You might have come to some of these poverty maps. They're quite well known. A man called Charles Booth went knocking on doors, and actually his volunteers asked people how much money they earned, how many rooms they had, what their condition was. And he did color-coded maps of the whole of the East End. The pinky ones are the richer people, people who are comfortable. He had, I think, a scale of 5 different degrees of poverty, getting darker and darker till you get black. And the black streets are where the people were absolutely in dire poverty and semi-criminal, he says. By the way, this is where so this is the Whitechapel Road. It's not the whole of London. Other people like Henry Mayhew and Frederick Engels also wrote to publicize the poverty of East London. Another thing they could do would be to join radical movements and even promote revolution, which happened in many countries in Europe. Or they could try and inject some Christianity into the poor parts of London. William Booth, standing in Whitechapel Road. In fact, he has 2 statues in Whitechapel, which is unusual. So Dr. William Booth set up his Salvation Army here and went round the pubs, as they still do, I think. I think they still do, collecting money, trying to save people's souls, trying to stop them drinking. They also built lots of missions. Bible schools. Well, apart from that, individual Victorians did have particular problems that they would like to try to alleviate. Lord Shaftesbury, people know of, who tried to campaign to get children out of factories. This gentleman, Dr. Bernardo, who set up, as you know, foster homes and homes for homeless and abandoned children in the East End of London. As a vine, if any of you know the Ragged School, do you know the Ragged School Museum along the canal? They have an exhibition of Dr. Bernardo. Lots of good photographs and even his desk and all sorts of things. It's a great exhibition. There was the famous Angela Burnett Coutts, a very rich lady who thought that the EastEnders needed space, and she and many other people organised the building of Victoria Park. Individual people, individual rich people, even overseas people spent money on trying to improve the lives of the EastEnders. Andrew Carnegie, most people know about. Many people don't know about Hastmore Edwards. You recognise the building? That's the Whitechapel Art Gallery. That's set up there. You can't see it, but it's Hastmore Edwards who built the library. The library's not part of the gallery. Okay. The biggest single thing that was put into the East End to try to improve the lot of people was the People's Palace at Mile End, which is still there as part of the university. But it was a hall where there would be culture brought to the people. Okay, that's one thing that people could do. Or they could go into the East End themselves with practical help and good example. We talked about Attlee going into the Haileybury Youth Club. There were also, as you know, university settlements where university students would come down from Oxford or Cambridge and come and do social work. The most famous one is still there, Toynbee Hall, Brick Lane, where Attlee lived for a while. There's also, as some of you know, Oxford House in Bethnal Green, which was set up by Keble College, Oxford. Another thing they could do would be to help local people through trades unions or through political action, now that people were getting the vote, to actually secure changes. So these last two things is what Clement Attlee did, right? Himself, full-time, become a sort of social worker, working through his old school's connections, but also through political action. Okay. What he would do, and this was his turning point, I suppose, he would help raise the poor from their condition by practical, pragmatic, and political action. His socialism came from first-hand experience of working class life, not from pamphlets or academics, not from revolutionaries, and that's what he set out to do. So I spent a while on that. With other sections, we won't do quite so much. Okay, so we got up to the beginning of the First World War. He's working in the youth club. He's a member of the Labour Party. He's been a council candidate. In August 1914, as you know, Britain stumbled into war. Attlee was now 31. He volunteered immediately, and because he was a graduate, was commissioned straight away. That's how it worked. And the war had a huge impact on his political views. There he is in uniform. This is our man. They all look alike, don't they? They all have these little moustaches. They're nice in uniforms. The officers get a cane. Putties. There we go. So this was the battalion that he was attached to.
So, for the benefit of those online, can you explain which one it is, because they can't see your point. They can't see.
You can't see.
They can't see your point.
Second from the right. You can't see my pointer from online. Okay. Second from the right. Sitting down. Okay. In early 1915, he was sent off with his regiment to Gallipoli, where, like many soldiers, he suffered from dysentery, and they put him on the boat home. But on the way home, he left the hospital ship because he felt better and went back to the front. The Gallipoli campaign, not going into detail, but when the British government, or at least Kitchener, Minister of War, decided to abort the whole of that campaign. Captain Attlee, as he was now, was the ADC of the general at Suvla Bay, which is one of the main battlefields. And it was Attlee who coordinated the withdrawal, organising it so brilliantly that the soldiers, the British and the Anzac soldiers, were able to leave the beach over several nights, totally secretly with no casualties. And Attlee and his general were the last two off the beach. Later on in the war, he was sent off to Mesopotamia, as it was called, Iraq these days, where he was wounded, leading his company into battle. As a major by then, he then finished up his war on the Western Front. I'm just going to say, I'll put a little map on here because I always think it's interesting that for many people, the First World War was the first time that they'd ever traveled anywhere. And for the soldiers going off to the Western Front, I know, but Gallipoli, of course, meant sending all your people to here, and then Mesopotamia up here. So actually, what I suppose you would call a successful war. He was major by the end of the war. He was actually quite lucky because both in Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia, shortly after he left, because he was wounded in Mesopotamia, his regiment was in a fierce battle and lots of his other fellow officers and soldiers were killed. Okay, so let's put that into a bit of context, the war, about how this affects his career. His brother Tom was actually a pacifist and was actually in prison during the war. But Attlee had no doubts whatsoever that he needed to join up as a volunteer to do his duty. His experiences of the realities of warfare and his good relationships with the ordinary soldiers would have had an effect on his outlook and his decision on what he was going to do after the war. He changed in a way from an unassuming man, quiet person with no great ambition, into someone with much stronger moral and leadership qualities. Gallipoli campaign, quite interesting. At the time, they called it the Dardanelles campaign. I'll add one more thing about it because it is relevant to our story. As a campaign, it's been endlessly reassessed by historians. Attlee thought, he wrote later, that the Gallipoli campaign could have been very successful if the troops on the British and the French side had been much more resolute. The strategy, you might know this, you probably know this, was conceived actually by the Royal Navy, the Admiralty. And the plan was actually the plan of the First Lord of the Admiralty, who happened to be Winston Churchill at the time. Attlee thought that had the campaign been managed better, it would have been a brilliant decision. During the Second World War, when Attlee was Deputy Prime Minister to Churchill, he never questioned Churchill's strategic or military decisions. Perhaps, well, he did say as much, that he trusted Churchill's judgment. Okay, I should say that his wounds in the Second World War were what they these days call friendly fire. It was a British shell that exploded, and he got shrapnel in his buttocks, which caused him a certain amount of trouble for much of his life. There you go. Okay, so after the war, he came straight back to his old job. We remember he had an allowance from his father. He decided that local politics and working in the East End was going to be what he was going to do. After the war, he comes straight back to his old job and into East End politics. In 1919, that's shortly after the war, he was elected Mayor of Stepney, here, Stepney, one of the poorest of the old-style London boroughs. There we are. Just in case you're not sure, the boroughs that existed at this time from the 1880s, I think, till the 1960s were much smaller than the London boroughs now. Our London Borough Tower Hamlets actually was in the past consisted of 3 boroughs: Bethnal Green, Stepney. These were merged, I think it was 1963 to 10. Okay, so he's at the age of 33 or 4, he's elected mayor of Stepney. The council that he was mayor of undertook as much action as it could to tackle slum landlords, to improve health in people's homes and at work, and to employ ex-servicemen, because there was a big problem with employment. He wrote a book, wrote several books actually. He wrote a book outlining how the life of people could be improved by government action rather than by charity. Charity was often condescending, people coming into the district to help out, as it were, and was intermittent. For Attlee, a decent life was a right for all citizens. That was a new concept, if you like. It wasn't part of the mainstream at that time, as it wasn't in most countries. He was always sure to keep on, not to break the law. And I say that because the mayor of, the mayor of Poplar, a man called George Lansbury, who probably many people know, refused, he and his council refused to level the rates because they said the population was too poor to pay. And in those days, any social help came out of the local budget. And George Lansbury and his whole council were actually imprisoned. Attlee was supportive, but he chose not to do the same. He believed that if you were elected, the Labour Party had to stay legal. The post-war, post-First World War period saw a big rise in the support of the Labour Party. Attlee was selected for and elected Member of Parliament for Limehouse. Right, Limehouse, sorry, Limehouse was a constituency within the borough of Poplar, so next door to them. That's just before then. This is Attlee here, standing in the middle with his chain of office around there. Came mayor with other mayors of London boroughs, marching to London to try to get the government to change the rulings so that the richer boroughs should contribute to a bigger amount of the poorer boroughs, which is what he did. That's his election address for standing for Parliament for Limehouse. He's lost his hair somewhere. Pretty quickly. So in 1922, then, he was elected Member of Parliament for Limehouse. He was a supporter of the leader of the Labour Party, Ramsay MacDonald, who ended up in 1924 briefly Prime Minister, and Attlee became his parliamentary private secretary. In 1926, whilst an MP, he was sent off with a commission to visit India to try to work out what the new constitutional situation in India should be, because the British government recognised they needed to make changes towards independence. That was his first interest in foreign affairs. In 1929, there was a second very brief Labour government when Ramsay MacDonald was, we say, levered into the situation that there was a huge financial crisis in 1931, and the Labour Party split. Ramsay MacDonald set up a national government, and lots of people in the Labour Party refused to go along with him. Attlee remained loyal. As a result of that, the next election, a lot of the Labour MPs, the senior ones, who had refused to accept Ramsay MacDonald, lost their seats. Now that's important because a lot of the more senior colleagues had lost their seats. So Attlee then becomes the deputy leader of the Labour Party. The leader of the Labour Party is George Lansbury from the next borough, and Attlee becomes deputy leader. That was in 1935. So, well, let's just look at the contexts of that. How did we get into that position? Attlee's willingness to do the daily tasks of a political party reliably and not having any political enemies helped him rise through the party, which had other more exciting people. He was called insignificant, he was called a mouse, and that was by people in his own party, lacking in any public charisma. He rejected many of the drastic totalitarian policies which had taken root in many of the European countries after the economic crash in the 1930s. As you know, many countries in Europe, in fact, a majority, ended up with totalitarian governments. Attlee rejected those policies totally in Britain. There was one famous occasion when he debated in the Cambridge Union against, I forgot his name, fascist leader. Mosley, sorry, Mosley had been a colleague actually in the government, but Mosley went off in the right direction and they convinced the people at the time in that particular debate that the legal route, the parliamentary route, was better, was more effective than the totalitarian route. He called himself Major Attlee all the time in his election addresses, and it was only much later that he stopped calling himself Major Attlee. Right, he had sort of in the meantime got married, 4 children, but he was always worried about not having enough money to keep them. Nevertheless, his children were sent to private schools. He had a very contented family life. This is him as a junior minister in Donald's government, looking very respectable. He always wore a 3-piece suit, nearly always with a watch chain. My grandfather. Here with his wife, yes, I think it's his wife. She had 3 daughters and a son. Very happy. It was a very happy family life. They moved to a house in West London. There they are in the garden. Very formally dressed. This is obviously a bit later in the Second World War. This is his wife, Violet, 3 of his 4 children. His wife, Violet, always drove him about at elections. Even until 1950, she was driving him around the country in their old Hillman Minx. Anybody remembers those? I remember. Okay. So Attlee is now the leader of the Labour Party in the late 1930s. He was very much in favour of supporting the League of Nations as the guarantor of peace. And you may know that in the 1930s and 40s, everybody had great hopes that the League of Nations would stop further wars. But as Hitler and Mussolini came to power and obviously showed contempt for the League of Nations, he led the Labour Party to support more defence spending. His family, in their home in West London, took in Jewish refugees, quietly, without telling anybody. Okay, so we've reached the Second World War. When war came in 1939, Attlee initially supported the government, Chamberlain's government, but 9 months later, was it? June 1940, May 1940, there was a crisis, and he insisted that Chamberlain leave, and he supported Churchill becoming Prime Minister. In a coalition, Attlee became Deputy Prime Minister with other Labour and one Liberal minister. And basically, Attlee ran the Home Front while Churchill managed the war. Churchill was his own foreign minister and minister of war, and was involved in diplomacy and military activities. So Attlee more or less ran the country for those 4 years, 5 years. I shall show that this. Attlee was very supportive of the Spanish government when the fascist states of Italy and Germany supported the rebels. He actually had a brigade in the international forces named after him. That's in Spain. Okay, so here's Attlee, as you can see, in Churchill's war cabinet. Some people whose names I remembered, some I had to look up. It was actually a very small and effective war cabinet, and it stayed more or less the same for the whole. Obviously, with Churchill in charge and Attlee as his deputy. Anthony, who became Prime Minister, as you know, John Anderson, Home Secretary. That's the two people in the back were the most important people as far as Attlee was concerned. In the back, Ernest Bevin, who seemed like a very strange choice to be Minister of Labour, but he was the leader of the largest trade union in Britain, and it was very important during the war that the working population and trades unions didn't demand extra wages, didn't go on strike, and supported all sorts of things, where there was labour was directed. People were directed jobs, they were stopped from leaving jobs, they were moved into other things. And it was very important that Ernest Bevin, as the leader of the Transport Workers Union, was there. He was actually Attlee's greatest ally. The other one, Lord Beaverbrook, was probably Attlee's greatest enemy, if that's what called him in the war cabinet. Lord Beaverbrook, Canadian owner of newspapers, was brought in by Churchill for all sorts of reasons, which I don't think anybody really knows, but he could get things done anyway. So during the war, Second World War, Attlee was in charge of basically the home front. He streamlined the administrative structures of government, and he used his skills through meetings, through policy, through cabinet meetings to turn the country's daily life into an effective, planned wartime operation. We're all too young to know what it was like to live in a war economy, but basically the government is in control of everything and makes all the decisions. Everything has to be planned, whether it's transport, production, whatever. And Attlee was very good at it. Governments never had so much power. They never had such power as they have in wartime. Attlee also, this is the crucial part, he set up a number of committees which, with great foresight, made plans for the post-war period. It was very much in his mind that after the First World War, soldiers came home, they'd been promised homes fit for heroes, etc., and there was mass unemployment and great disturbance because nothing changed. Attlee, as Deputy Prime Minister in the war, was determined that the planning for the post-war world would be different. Compared to Churchill, Attlee had a very low profile. He kept the non-conservatives in the government and in the nation and the trades unions on side during the war. He seems to have had no reservations about policy, war policy. He had no reservations about the bombing of German cities, which people today question, nor in using the atom bomb. He didn't question that in any way. In May 1945, then, with the defeat of Germany, but not yet Japan, the Labour Party left the coalition, and that meant they would have to have an election. Okay, it was widely expected that Churchill, as the victorious Prime Minister, would be swept to victory at the end of the war, as had happened with Lloyd George at the end of the First World War. But in fact, as you know, Labour actually won a huge majority, and Attlee became Prime Minister. That David Lowe cartoon, I think, is one of the great cartoons. It shows the coalition, the forces, the politicians rolling up their sleeves at the beginning of the war to fight side by side. I think it's a brilliant cartoon. The faces for them, Churchill, Attlee, Elizabeth, Morrison. And certainly the whole population behind it. I think it's a great picture. Attlee loved campaigning. Now he was MP for Limehouse, so he would be campaigning somewhere not very far from here. He loved campaigning in election time. Elections weren't television elections. There was no television then. It was a newspaper election and public meetings, and politicians went round endlessly talking to public meetings and groups of people, and Attlee loved doing it. Right. So in July 1945, Attlee became Prime Minister. It was a strange election because it took 3 weeks to get the ballot papers from the troops. And there were millions of British troops outside the country then. Singapore, Hong Kong, still fighting the Japanese. So it took 3 weeks after polling day before the results were counted. Okay, so this is the Daily Herald, which is a Labour supporting paper. I love the little bit at the top. It says, please send this off to troops. So, Attlee and his wife, right next to a great man's son, palace drama. Well, it wasn't much of a drama because there was a witness at Buckingham Palace when Attlee went to see the king. Attlee dressed up in his morning suit, as you do on these occasions, and went in. And there was, it says, after, this is a courtier reported this, after an initial awkward silence, Attlee said to the king, "Sir, I won the election." The king replied, "I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news." Neither the king nor Attlee had a great way with words. Okay. So let's think about the context of this. Attlee had devoted his time during the war to the homeland. He was never seen to be pessimistic, never appeared to disagree, but he did have to moderate Churchill sometimes, but they were generally comfortable working with each other. Coalitions are hard, especially ones that go on for 4 or 5 years. The context is that people expected a better country after the unemployment and the hardships that there had been in the 30s after the First. And they did associate that with employment and hardship with Conservative governments. Labour promised what we now call the welfare state, a state which aims to provide fuller social support for everyone as a right, not as charity. And Attlee appealed to people's sense of community and public spirit as citizens. The context of the election is quite interesting because during the war there had been no elections. So there hadn't been a general election for 10 years. So many newer voters were voting for the first time, and they did separate in their minds Churchill in the war and what should follow. People, especially servicemen, were persuaded by the optimism of Labour's vision. There's election night. They counted 3 parliamentary seats together at Mile End, People's Palace. This is Attlee winning Limehouse. This is another Labour MP whose name I don't know, who was a MP for Poplar, I think. This man's interesting. He's the 3rd person elected in the Baron Poplar, and as you know, his name was Phil Piratin. Anyone? There's the result. Clement Attlee, result of the election. Isn't that quite interesting? The tiny number of voters. After this election, they did actually have to redistribute the seats because the number of people who left during the war was amazing. So there's Mr. Clement Attlee, communist. Two communists were elected at the end of the Second World War, and it's quite interesting just that it was said that this created a certain amount of problems in the United States because the American government, especially Congress, were discussing whether they should continue lending Britain money. And the idea that there were communists in the government, in Parliament, didn't impress them. One of the reasons that Churchill lost the election, Attlee and the King got on very well together, actually. The King much preferred Attlee to Churchill. One of the things that Churchill did was to lose his sense of decorum, or whatever it is, balance. In the Daily Express, which was Lord Beaverbrook's newspaper, he made this comment that if Labour were elected, they'd have to have a Gestapo, he used the word, they'd have to have a secret police to force people to do all these things. And of course, nobody believed it because Attlee's government had just spent the war helping fight against Hitler. Okay, so Attlee as Prime Minister. During the next 5.5 years then, 1945, 1951, Attlee's government enacted a wide-ranging program changes his chance, okay, to do the things that he wanted to do, under very difficult external constraints. He had a stable team of ministers who'd actually been working together in government during the war. Now, I want to have a look at that picture. This is Attlee's cabinet. We don't need to know the names. It's very interesting to look at that and see what you think. You don't need to volunteer. They are actually all old men, apart from a lady called Anne Wilkinson, who seems like sort of stuck on the end. She was actually very small. She was Minister of Education. She was actually very small. But these people, the war cabinet, or not, a lot of these have been in the war cabinet. So this is Attlee's government, which was more or less stable for the whole of those 5 years, with Attlee in the middle. Ernest Bevin, who we made Foreign Secretary, much to many people's surprise. Herbert Morrison was Home Secretary. Dalton, Stafford Cripps. Stafford Cripps is the one who wears brown shoes. I was told should be brown shoes. But he was the most radical. They were not a radical government. They were not revolutionaries in any way. They had all worked their way up either through trade unions or the local government. The only person who was perhaps radical is stuck on the back, Lion Bevan, who actually very cleverly gave him the job of setting up the National Health Service because he was a natural rebel and he didn't quite reach the course, but was actually quite successful in them. So, what did they do? They have the chance, the first time that the Labour Party have a majority in Parliament, in fact, a huge majority in Parliament. You know some of these things. A lot of nationalisation. They brought into public ownership a large section of society, Bank of England, civil aviation, coal mining, railways, road transport, telecoms, that was the telephones, gas and electricity. About 20% of the economy was brought into government control. The workers in those organisations got better working conditions and there was a lot of new investment, the beginnings of lots of investment. The intention was to plan the economy in peacetime as they had during the war. Housing was a big issue. You probably know that in the war, the local defence forces logged every bomb that fell. 40,000 bombs had fallen on the borough of Step during the whole of the East End. There was a huge expansion then of housing. A lot of new house builds were started. A lot of temporary housing was put up. Even into the 1950s, as you might know, a lot of people lived in those temporary prefabs, including me. Right. If you know the Lansbury estate in Poplar, they planned a new estate. It's where Crisp Street Market is, which was the height of new housing. And instead of the rows of small terraced houses, there were blocks of flats and grass and a traffic-free shopping plaza. It hasn't worn very well. They legislated for the green belt in new towns. The welfare state is sort of what the government is remembering. The National Health Service was finally set up, bringing together all sorts of previous voluntary and privately organised health systems. There was a comprehensive provision of support for employed, elderly families, implementing something called the Beveridge Report during the war, which was one of the things that Attlee had commissioned. So the concept that the state is responsible for people's welfare, health, and education, not as a charity, but as a right, was something that was perhaps new. Farmers were subsidised to provide more food. In education, the school leaving age was raised immediately to 15, and large sums were put into all aspects of schools and technical education, but they didn't make comprehensive secondary education compulsory. They made no changes to private education. Rationing continued. There were continued controls over the whole economy still. We'll talk about why that was important. In foreign policy, Attlee replaced Churchill at the Potsdam Conference. Now, at the end of the war, the conference, which was to decide what was going to happen in Europe, while the Japanese War was still going on, featured the Russians, Stalin, Molotov, the Brits, Attlee, with Bevin, the Americans, Truman, and others. Now, the Potsdam Conference started while Churchill was still Prime Minister. Churchill went home for the election result, and he lost. So Attlee replaced Churchill at the Potsdam Conference, much to the surprise of Stalin. That sort of thing wouldn't happen to him. Anyway, Attlee had hoped that the alliance of the Second World War, UK, France, United States, Soviet Union, could somehow help settle the world after the war. Having defeated fascism, he thought that maybe the Soviet Union would join in the new United Nations and would be a positive force to try and keep the peace. But the events in Eastern Europe, i.e. when Russia, the Soviet Union, took over the countries of Eastern Europe, and Berlin changed his mind. The Labour Party, which had sometimes been seen as a semi-pacifist party, had always been very anti-communist, and the Labour Party fairly soon after resumed its strong anti-communist stance. Attlee agreed to develop nuclear weapons in the UK secretly, and would continue as a strong ally of the United States when he needed. The other thing that Attlee's government did was to start the process of decolonisation. The Labour Party had always been in favour of giving independence to the colonies. They saw that the colonial period was over, but they were cautious. They started the process but it wasn't without difficulty, which caused the government quite a lot of difficulties. Attlee there, speaking at one of the first United Nations conferences at the Central Hall, Westminster. A cartoon, perhaps a bit of a sad cartoon, really. Britain had decided that India should become independent. They had hoped it would be done peacefully. That didn't happen, as you know, and that the British colony of India was split up between India and Pakistan, Bangladesh later. And it was not done peacefully, despite the attempts of the British government and the Viceroy. Who was Attlee's choice, tried their hardest, but in fact the British actually left with quite a lot of violence continuing, as you know. The British government also had problems in Malaya, Middle East, especially where Palestine proved an impossible situation, still is. The British government has, you probably know, they had the responsibility for the whole of Palestine after the war, with the mass after the Holocaust, with huge numbers of Jews wanting to settle in Palestine. Violence erupted. The British government couldn't keep the peace and basically walked away, handed it over to the United Nations. So the Labour government started the process of establishing self-government in quite a few of the colonies, the African colonies, and also with the King's support. This is quite important in a way. They did oversee the move from empire to commonwealth. The idea that there would be a commonwealth to replace the empire and that India might join in, but if it was a republic, was certainly thanks to the Attlee's government. Okay, the context of this. Attlee's government had a clear mandate for its ambitious programme. The reports and the planning during the war have been widely read and discussed, but there were huge challenges to that post-war government. The war had bankrupted Britain, whilst the physical damage, including repair, replacement required, was enormous. Here in the East End, no, industry, housing, infrastructure, because the docks had been totally devastated. Every business in Britain had spent 5-6 years geared up to war production. Hundreds of thousands of servicemen had to be demobilized. Despite an unsettled post-war world where British troops were involved, the occupation of Germany, the Korean War still, the Malaysian War and against the Japanese, and then the Korean War, which began in the late 1940s. The Berlin airlift, where the British government and the Americans had to fly supplies into Berlin. All these things were incredibly expensive, keeping troops, which they didn't want to keep. The other problem was that the Americans, who had lent Britain large amounts of money and armaments during the war, almost immediately stopped, much to the surprise of the British government. And the UK was expected to start repaying its debts. In the end, the pound had to be devalued, and improvements to people's lives were taking time to be felt. People were getting maybe slightly restless. Things were not getting better as quickly as people wanted. The image we have of the time, think of some of those post-war films, a grey one, certainly in London. People dressed drably, smoke-darkened buildings, fog, bomb sites, and when someone called it the age of austerity, it perhaps felt like that. So they couldn't do it. The government couldn't do the things that it wanted to do as quickly as they wanted. Attlee himself never wavered from his democratic socialism and his calm and modest personality sort of blunted the ideological criticism because it was a radical socialist program. As you can imagine, the Conservative press and Churchill opposed the government, opposed Attlee's government robustly, even though Churchill actually was not there very much, he was busy writing his memoirs. The cabinet that we showed pictures of were actually quite harmonious at the beginning, but there were various attempts to actually replace Attlee. The person behind this was Morrison, who was the London Labour Party leader, who felt he should be leader. He felt he had more energy, he was a better speaker, he was a good fixer. He passed on to his grandson, Peter Banks. His cabinet was fairly harmonious, but Attlee was criticised for not being a leader enough, not showing leadership. He let his ministers get on with their jobs. In cabinet, he said very little. He let discussions go, make a decision at the end, that was it. He was very terse. He wasn't very good at persuading people of this. He would write people notes saying, that was a bad thing you said today, don't do that again. He was also preoccupied with foreign affairs, as we've said. The post-war world was not as they had hoped it would be. Even once the Japanese war had finished, there were massive problems with SSR and with getting troops home. The British government, as we said, did choose to develop some nuclear weapons. It wasn't knowledge at the time. I'm sure lots of you have seen the Oppenheimer film. It didn't help that the Americans, especially American Congress, distrusted the British scientists. They distrusted people. They didn't want to share what the British had actually very willingly shared in the war. It perhaps showed that they were right because of the spy Klaus Fuchs was one of the British scientists who'd gone to help on the project. He turned out to have been a Russian spy. Anyway, by 1950, the government was exhausted. We saw a lot of the personalities were elderly men. They were older, they became somewhat quarrelsome. There were lots of economic clouds quickly on the horizon. The costs of rearmament, disagreements led to the government not having enough money, devaluing, not being able to export enough, and it came to a certain head when in the new National Health Service, it was decided that they would have to charge people for some things, spectacles and teeth. And it seems a very small issue to us, but it led to Bevan resigning, becoming quite a rebel. So there was no peace dividend for the British. People were tired of austerity in a way. Rationing had continued after the war because Britain couldn't afford to import food. There was an election in 1950 and Labour lost a lot of seats. So they were re-elected with only a very small majority. Churchill then was still leader of the Conservative Party, and that government only lasted a year, and Churchill won the next election in 1951. So it was the end of that government. Because of our wonderful electoral system, in 1951, the Labour Party still won more votes than the Conservatives, but they lost in the number of seats. Attlee decided to continue as leader of the opposition, much to some surprise of some people. There were arguments because he hadn't done much to bring on newer talent. There were young people like Bevan, Harry Wilson, Gaitskell, even Roy Jenkins. But in 1955, the Conservatives won a much bigger majority under Anthony Eden, and Attlee retired at the end in 1956. Hugh Gaitskell succeeded him. Do you remember Hugh Gaitskell? Sorry. a great lost leader, I think, in many ways. He died very young. So on his retirement, Attlee received peerage, well, Attlee, hereditary in those days. So his son and now his grandson inherited his title. He traveled a lot. He did lots of world tours because he was seen as an elder statesman, and he did a lot of traveling on behalf of the British government. I'll come back to that in a minute. He actually spent quite a lot of time chatting away to Churchill, who was a bit gargan like that, actually. But they sort of forgave each other their arguments they had from time to time. So he travelled a lot. He wrote, did book reviews, he wrote a certain amount of memoirs, but they weren't actually very interesting. He did travel a lot. He went sort of on behalf of the British government to China. He was the first Western leader to meet Mao Zedong. And he retired. He was always a modest man. Someone said he was a modest man, but then he has so much to be modest about. I think that was somebody in his own party. He was. It was various people, supposed to be. Lady Astor said it. Someone said it was Churchill. Whatever. He was always criticised for his lack of charisma, his terse public language. I did think of trying to get a bit of a recording to play. He was no orator. His voice would not work on television. He had a slightly reedy voice, not a strong voice. He would have been a terrible politician in television. But most people have seen his stronger side. One person said, he was a serious man and a patriot. He was all substance, no show. That was Margaret Thatcher's opinion. One of the things that he did do, apart from getting involved in diplomatic things, he did speak against joining the European Economic Community, as it then was. He had been a great supporter of the countries of Europe coming together, but he didn't include Britain. He thought that Britain's traditions were such that we should not join. Okay. He believed in the Prime Minister being the chairman, letting the cabinet get on with things. And his reassuring personality meant that although the programme was a radical socialist programme, he didn't really have much opposition in terms of ideology and practicality. In his later years, he seemed to get a little bit grumpy about some things. He sometimes sounded as if people weren't grateful enough, that people had forgotten too soon about what conditions were like before them, poverty, the past, the dull past, and that people were selfish and too materialistic. His view was always that the people, the population from whichever class, were a community of people, that their values were civic values, and that this was the sort of society he wanted. And I think our materialist age that we now have would have upset him. I'm going to just go back to one thing. If you want a summary of the things he did, just look at that for a moment. Now, I must tell you that this is not an objective statement. This comes from Labour supporters. So, to paraphrase somebody else, if you want to see sort of monument to Attlee's government, then look around you. How is he commemorated? Well, there's a statue that used to be outside the Limehouse Library. That's now in Queen Mary College. It's not actually very good likeness. It looks more like Gandhi in the picture, but that's inside the university grounds. There's a plaque on the house where he grew up in Putney. The person unveiling it is his grandson, the current Clement Attlee, who sits in the House of Lords as a conservative. There you go. He wrote a lot of letters. He wrote poetry in his life. He wrote some memoirs which were so terse that they didn't really give anything away. He corresponded with lots of people. If you remember the first slide we had about the way that he was honoured. He wrote that himself. Okay, have we got time for any comments or questions?
I think, thank you first very much, Geoff, for a comprehensive picture of Clement Attlee, which has been thorough and most engaging. So thank you very much. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, please, Frank.
You spoke about Attlee being a chairman. I get the impression from what you said that in this great reforming government of the 1940s, he was more an enabler than the driver of these ideas. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think all the people who were his cabinet ministers certainly thought that he let them get on with things. Certainly with Aneurin Bevan, who was not a natural party team player. He gave him his head to sort out the health service, which was a really difficult job because, as you probably know, a lot of the doctors didn't want to join because they were preferred to be self-employed. A lot of the hospitals were charities and didn't want to give up their independence. And he actually did it very well, but Attlee never interfered with that at all. He also had huge amount of criticism of conservatives. But no, Attlee was a chairman, and he was all his life. He was not an outspoken person. He was a team player. And I think that's what a lot of people liked about him. Whether leadership would have brought different results if he'd actually been a person who banged the table and said, no, you've got to do this, I don't do that. He did play off his rivals. Herbert Morrison was his biggest rival, and Stafford Cripps as well. And several times they tried to topple him, but he managed to play them off against each other, mainly with the support of Bevan, who was his solid help all the time during the war. And when Bevan died, he lost a bit of his oomph, I think.
Thank you. Any others?
Yeah.
Mr. Sweden at the back there.
Mr. Sweden.
Please. Yes.
Yeah. Let me answer this. What was the like when he displaced Lansbury as part of him? Was that kind of
No, Lansbury retired. He was not a healthy man. George Lansbury was an elderly man, even when he was mayor of Poplar and was sent to prison. But he was replaced without any problem. He retired. And as we said, Attlee was one of the few leaders in the Labour Party who still had a seat in Parliament at that time. He probably wouldn't have become party leader if others had still had their seats, but they didn't.
But you also, I don't know what you're talking about, but I live in Walthamstow, and Attlee was.
Well, I tell you what happened. The 1945 election was fought on old boundaries, as we said. They had totally different levels of constituents, but they did actually reorganize the boundaries, and Attlee had to find a new seat. So for the 1950 election and 51, he fought Walthamstow West. Yes, that's the Walthamstow connection. That's the title he took in his peerage.
I used to live in his ex-constituency, but I moved down to Eastbourne, what was Eastbourne, so it was a solid conservative. Of course, Churchill was far away.
In Woodford, yeah.
Yes, thank you. And there speaks also the former mayor of Walthamstow.
Oh, right.
Was that your mayoralty, Richard?
I was mayor of Waltham Forest.
Waltham Forest, I beg your pardon, but yeah.
My only power was to serve alcohol without which I did to its fullest possible extent.
Attlee wasn't a teetotaler by any means.
Eddie, I think you had a question?
Yeah, why was there an election in 1951?
Why was it?
Yeah.
Because the Labour Party was re-elected in 50, but with only, I think it was a majority of 5, and they couldn't survive.
Well, I think we've overrun our time a little bit. It's been most engaging. Thank you all very much for your questions, and thank you to Geoff for the talk. I'll just conclude by saying that next month's talk, the 19th of December, is a former chief executive of St Christopher's Hospice who is coming to present that month's talk. But also before that in December, the Carol concert on Wednesday 13th of December, and the organ vespers on the first Saturday of the month, to which you're all invited. And there will be, as there are this evening, refreshments at the back of the church for both those events, all 3 of those events as well, as there always are.